According to data confirmed directly on the Government of Canada's Old Age Security Recovery Tax page, the income threshold that triggers a clawback of your pension has just been adjusted again, and if your net income crosses that line, Ottawa does not ask permission before it starts taking your OAS back. For the 2024 tax year, that threshold sits at $90,997. For 2025, it climbs to $93,454. By 2026, it reaches $95,323. On the surface, that looks like relief, an inflation adjustment working in your favor. But ask yourself this: how much of your lifetime savings in this country quietly evaporates the moment your RRIF withdrawals, your CPP, your part-time consulting income, and your investment returns add up to cross that number? How many cents of every dollar above that threshold does the Canada Revenue Agency claim before you ever see it? The answer is 15 cents on every dollar over the line, clawed back month by month, often without retirees fully realizing it until the notice of assessment lands in their mailbox. And the threshold rises every year specifically because your other income, your pensions, your bracket creep are also rising. This is not a benefit increase. This is a moving target designed to look generous while it tightens around exactly the retirees who did everything right. For those aged 75 and over, the cushion is supposed to be wider, reaching $154,196 for the 2026 period, a number Ottawa frames as compassion for the oldest and most vulnerable. But strip away the framing, and what remains is this: the system openly acknowledges that retirement income above a precise indexed line is treated as a liability to the public purse, not a private achievement. Whatever you built over 40 years of contributing, whatever your employer pension pays out, whatever your RRIF forces you to withdraw, once it crosses that government-drawn line, part of it is no longer yours to keep. This sentiment is not abstract, and it is not limited to one province or one income bracket. Across retiree forums, Facebook groups built specifically for Canadian seniors, and the comment sections beneath national financial coverage, a consistent picture has emerged over the past year. Recently retired professionals describe discovering, often after the fact, that a single RRIF withdrawal pushed them over the recovery threshold and triggered a clawback they had not budgeted for at the start of the year. Households managing a combined defined benefit pension and CPP describe watching their OAS shrink in the very same 12 months that inflation pushed their grocery and heating bills higher. Long-time savers who did exactly what financial institutions told them to do for decades, contribute to an RRSP, defer CPP for the larger monthly payment, build a disciplined nest egg, describe a quiet sense of having been penalized for saving too successfully. The macro numbers published on a government web page and the lived reality of a senior household trying to make a fixed income stretch through a Canadian winter are increasingly the same story told twice, once in policy language and once in a kitchen table budget. But that is not the most alarming part. The recovery tax threshold is only the visible mechanism. Behind it sits a much larger structural vulnerability tied directly to decisions made in Ottawa and at the Bank of Canada. Interest rate policy over the past several years has reshaped the return profile of nearly every instrument considered safe by retirees, including guaranteed investment certificates, government bonds, and high-interest savings accounts. When the Bank of Canada lowers its policy rate to support a slowing economy, the yield on the conservative capital preserving instruments that seniors rely on falls in lockstep, often within weeks. At the same time, the federal government's own fiscal position, with debt servicing costs that have climbed into the tens of billions of dollars annually, places long-term pressure on the sustainability of indexed benefit programs. The Canada Pension Plan itself is generally regarded as actuarially sound according to its own chief actuary's long-range projections because it is funded by a dedicated, professionally invested asset pool. Old age security is structured very differently. It is paid directly out of general federal tax revenue year by whichever government holds office at the time. That is a fundamentally different kind of promise than a pension fund backed by invested assets. It is a policy commitment rather than a contractual guarantee, and policy commitments can be, and historically have been, adjusted when the fiscal math becomes uncomfortable for the government of the day. For a retiree, depending on that income to cover rent, prescription costs not reimbursed by a provincial drug formulary, and a winter heating bill, this is not an abstract risk discussed by economists. It is the foundation their entire monthly budget is built on top of, and that foundation is more political than it appears. The second wave of pressure tightens around the very benefits seniors have been taught to think of as guaranteed for life. The OAS clawback is the most visible trap, but it does not act alone. The Guaranteed Income Supplement, designed specifically for the lowest income seniors, is reduced on a sliding scale as other income rises, which means a retiree who picks up modest part-time work or who finally sees a meaningful return on a long-held investment can watch their GIS shrink in the very same year their other income improves. This is benefit dilution in its purest, most mechanical form, a system where doing slightly better financially in one column produces an almost invisible penalty in another, often with no warning beyond a smaller deposit several months later. Layer onto that the mandatory minimum withdrawal schedule attached to a registered retirement income fund. Once an RRSP is converted at age 71, the government does not ask whether a retiree actually needs the money in a given year. It requires withdrawal of a fixed age-based percentage, taxed in full as ordinary income, whether the markets have just delivered strong returns or whether they have just delivered a punishing correction. For a substantial number of retirees, this mandatory RRIF meltdown is the single largest driver of an unplanned OAS clawback because the withdrawal itself is not optional, the tax treatment is not negotiable, and the timing is dictated entirely by a birth date rather than by financial need. Provincial healthcare costs compound the squeeze from an entirely different direction. OHIP in Ontario, the Medical Services Plan structure in British Columbia, and RAMQ in Quebec were never designed to cover the full financial reality of aging. Dental care, the majority of prescription drugs outside narrow provincial formularies, home care support, and long-term care placement increasingly fall to the individual or the family to fund out of pocket. A senior who has spent a working lifetime assuming that provincial healthcare coverage means comprehensive coverage is frequently confronted at precisely the moment they are least equipped to absorb a financial shock with a 5-figure invoice for a procedure, a piece of medical equipment, or a long-term care placement that the public system does not fully underwrite. This is where severe budgetary strain stops being a phrase used in a financial column and becomes a specific, unavoidable check that has to be written. There is a particular irony sitting underneath all of this that deserves to be named directly. Each January, CPP and OAS payments are adjusted upward to keep pace with inflation, and on the surface that indexing looks like the system working exactly as intended, protecting retirees from losing ground. Look one layer deeper and the picture changes. That same indexed increase nudges net income higher, which can be enough on its own to cross a federal tax bracket, to narrow GIS eligibility for a lower income senior, or to push a retiree already sitting close to the OAS recovery threshold over the line for the first time. The inflation adjustment that was meant to protect purchasing power can, in the same calendar year, trigger a benefit reduction that erases a meaningful share of that very increase. A retiree can finish a year technically receiving more government income than the year before, while ending up with less in their account after the recovery tax and the GIS reduction are applied. That is not a hypothetical. That is the mechanical result of indexed benefits sitting inside a system of fixed indexed clawback thresholds, and it is precisely the kind of detail that does not show up in a headline announcing a CPP increase. And then the threat arrives at its smallest, most personal scale, which is the household budget itself. Carbon pricing and broader food inflation do not show up as a single dramatic headline number on a kitchen table. They show up as a retiree standing in the aisle of a Loblaws or a Sobeys, doing quiet mental arithmetic between the cost of a prescription not covered by their provincial plan and the cost of keeping the thermostat at a tolerable level through a prairie, maritime, or northern Ontario winter. They show up as a fixed CPP and OAS payment that buys measurably less at the till than it did 18 months earlier, even while the nominal dollar figure printed on the deposit notice looks unchanged, or even slightly higher. This is purchasing power evaporation in its most literal daily form. The number on paper stays the same or grows, while the life that number can actually sustain quietly shrinks underneath it. Given all of this, what actually constitutes a defensible, Canada-compliant response, not a promise of immunity from any of these pressures, but a serious approach to risk mitigation? Three structural tools deserve consideration, each addressing a different point of vulnerability, and none of them should be mistaken for personalized financial or investment advice. These are general risk management concepts, and any decision should be made together with a qualified licensed advisor who understands a retiree's full tax and income picture in their specific province. The first tool is the tax-free savings account. As of 2026, the annual contribution limit stands at $7,000, and any Canadian who has been eligible since the program's introduction in 2009 and has never contributed holds up to $109,000 in available cumulative room. Because TFSA withdrawals are not counted as income for tax purposes, they do not affect the net income calculation used for the OAS recovery tax or the GIS clawback, making the TFSA one of the only legal mechanisms inside the Canadian system to draw down savings without feeding the very threshold that triggers benefit erosion. The second tool is a deliberate advisor-guided RRIF drawdown strategy, in some cases structured to begin earlier and more gradually than the mandatory minimum requires, with the specific goal of smoothing taxable income across multiple years rather than concentrating it in a way that repeatedly pushes a retiree over the recovery threshold in any single tax year. The third is liquidity protection through guaranteed investment certificates or annuity products, which, depending on how they are structured, can provide predictable, laddered income that is considerably easier to forecast against a fixed OAS threshold than market-linked returns capable of swinging unpredictably from one tax year to the next. None of these tools eliminate the underlying structural pressure described throughout this analysis. The recovery thresholds will keep moving upward in step with inflation and indirectly with the income that triggers the clawback in the first place. The mandatory RRIF withdrawal schedule will not pause for a difficult market year. The provincial healthcare gaps will not close on their own initiative. What these tools offer instead is a measure of genuine control over the timing and shape of taxable income, which, inside a system built around precise, indexed cutoff lines rather than individual circumstances, is often the only lever a retiree actually has available to them. So here is the question worth sitting with before the next round of CRA threshold adjustments is confirmed. If your net income crossed next year's recovery tax line by even a few $1,000s, would you already know exactly how much of your OAS you stood to lose, with a plan already in motion to manage it? Or would you be finding out for the first time when the notice of assessment arrives in the mail? Leave a comment below describing how you are restructuring your retirement income this year to stay ahead of these thresholds in your specific province, and which number on this page is the one keeping you up at night. We will be back the moment the next set of figures is confirmed.